Hi, this is Ivy Quinn, and I am also Margaret Bates, but as an author, I'm Ivy Quinn, as an editor of Margaret Bates, but I'm hosting the horror writers, thriller writers, mystery suspense writers online panel for the Right Women Book Festival and the organizers there. So today we have with us Jessica L. Sparrow and Olivia Springer, and they'll be talking about their work and how they got into sort of the speculative side of fiction. And we'll start with both of you introducing yourselves and just telling us a little bit about how you got started.
Sure. Want me to go first?
Yeah, sure, Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica L. Sparrow. I'm actually a Puerto Rican Gothic horror writer. And essentially, the way I got into speculative fiction is that um, I guess I was born onto it. Uh, my entire family, including myself, are very like horror fanatics. We have like a lot of folklore stories within the family and supernatural happenings and such as that. So that's been part of my upbringing. And so as I guess, a natural storyteller, yeah, I incorporate it within my writing. It's almost like if I even tried to write something different, some weird supernatural element would just find its way into it.
And Olivia, how did you get started and tell us a little about yourself and your author journey? Just get started.
So, I actually have always been writing in general. I think for me, I also grew up liking horror. Like I collect skulls. I have like bats and things on me as I speak. I think that for me, I also actually, when that shift turned to mystery a little bit more was maybe around 2012, 2013, when my grandmother passed away. Um, and in that same vein, when I was younger, even though I've always been like a horror fan, gothic kid, my writing was more romance and fan fiction. And I think that change of that death brought me more inward. And so my writing, while always a little fantastic and a little speculative, started to become darker in a sense of what can change and what can we face and address. And so it sort of became like the beginning of a type of shadow work for me, to work through that death, and also the start of like this sort of like reclaiming for me. Um, so like my grandmother, my father's side of the family is from Trinidad, and I've always loved that I have that connection to diaspora there. Um, but I think that once I started to write into mystery and horror, that also opened up a new wave, a new connection. Um, and that led to that reclaiming process. Like a lot of what I write also is very like it's also very witchy, also very like my next project, and we'll talk about that a little bit more because I believe that's one of the questions. But like I've gotten very much into connecting to Orisha, and as part of that sort of reclaiming of self, um, like I ask people to pronounce my name with like a O pronunciation because if you look at the West African deities, first of all, they're called the Orisha, and most of their names are pronounced. Most of them have O names, and they're pronounced like Ogun, Oshun, Oya. So in a way, it's been like this long sort of like reclaiming of self through writing these darker genres.
It's really cool, like to be able to get in touch with yourself through your writing. And so you guys talked about what inspired you just to write at the beginning, a lot of your roots, but currently when you get ideas or you start being inspired for some of your current projects, where do you get those ideas from? I guess that's a big question to always ask writers is, well, where do you even come up with the idea for a whole book or a story? Um, we did Jessica first, then Olivia, but Olivia, you can start, then Jessica, and you can jump in with each other. But
Yeah, yeah.
So for me, I've often, my own personal little joke is that my goal is to kill people for a living. Um, but a lot of I like to describe my writing with the Fallout Boy quote. I want these words to make things right, but it's the wrongs that make the words come to life. And so a lot of my writing, particularly for like horror and mystery, I found that a lot of my mystery stories, because I have two big mystery personal projects that I'm working on, and one of those came out of grief and the other one came out of anger and spite. And then a lot of my horror writing, I'm someone who cares a lot about social justice issues. And so, like, I'm often trying to right wrongs. Like, I'm literally trying to right wrongs um, using horror as a door opener. Um, So yeah, those are the biggest places. But I also like just like a third thing. Um, Another thing that helps with my inspiration is sometimes I just write my dreams. Like if I've had a nightmare and I'm like, that was scary, oh my God, I gotta write that down. So,
Nothing like your brain giving you inspiration. And Jessica?
exactly.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything, and it's like the way Olivia had explained, because like she mentioned having her Trinidadian roots, um being Puerto Rican, our diaspora is pseudo the same. Like I'm saying that with like the utmost respect. Like I don't want to be like, oh, we're just exactly the same, but the thing is that like we are rooted within our like African ancestors. And so harkening back to when I explained of like my family having folkloric stories, just sit around a bonfire, we'll talk about some things, but um it's that is the inspiration that comes from the injustices of what's happened to like our ancestors, like the injustices that are happening to this day, unfortunately. And so some of the inspiration comes from that. Then other inspiration can be from, because I am like I will sit down and watch horror movies back to back to back. My husband gets he loves horror movies, but he gets sick of like I don't want to sit and watch movies all day, and I'm just like in an element of just I'm watching, but my brain is also like seeing a whole other story in my head. And it happens to me when I'm listening to historical podcasts. I'm always stuck in like either the 1800s or like early 1900s. And when I'm hearing historical podcasts of within those eras, my brain just goes into something else. And I try to wonder like if someone like me from my cultural background and my experience, and also like originally being from Newark, New Jersey, with like no silver spoon in my mouth, like how would have my ancestors survived within, the Gothic European experience of the 1800s,
Yeah.
aside from, being, and I'm sorry to say it, but this is how they like written us in characters as a slave or a monster of some sort. Like, what if we flip that to where the real truth was like who the real monsters were, and how would we deal with that? And so that's where a lot of my stories come from. It's always wondering and thinking that like what if it was written in a way where there was the truth about the injustices, and that we weren't these like creatures to be feared or to be inferior to other races and such. So typically that's where it comes from. Also, sometimes it's just an idea will hit me, and I'll see the whole thing like a movie, and I am just like writing away almost like possessively. So I, to get me into the mood, I'm like listening to music from that era. I'm looking at pictures from within that era. It's almost as if like I'm time traveling in sort of way, like spiritually. So yeah,
Get that immersion and to almost create that automatic writing setup, like the dictation from like deeper
yeah.
part of inspiration. Um, so some of you, I mean, you've mentioned, Olivia, that you do, or at least for a while, you wrote more like the romance side, some fandom side, then you switched into the more the mystery, and you are just like a more like gothic horror. Are there any other subgenres you've hit on over your time, or you sort of feel like at this point you found your groove? Or are there other types within sort of the speculative umbrella one day you might want to try?
I am I'm also like, even though I love gothic horror, but I also noticed that like I have a profound love for folk horror. Like, I'll watch, there's this like awesome documentary on Prime right now. It has a really long name, but
It's
it's
the 3.5 months, like the woods, lonely, dark, and deep, or
yes,
something
yes,
that
yes.
Shutter made. I've watched that. I watched it when I was moving house from Virginia 2 years ago, just like as I was packing. But it's so interesting, and like every movie is that they mention, I was like, I got to make a list. So if you haven't seen
Yeah,
Olivia, it's really worth checking out too.
there is a list on I think it's called Letterbox. Someone actually put a list of all the movies on that because I looked for it and I think I've seen the documentary at least three times, even though it's like 3.5 hours. But it really is so fascinating and so worth it. And yeah, it really touches on the very beginnings of what like what folk horror was. So like I've always been into that. And then when you really think about it, um talking about like the diaspora, all of our stories, when it comes from that, all of the legends and respectfully the lore are our folk horror. Those lessons and those things, but we're talking about folk horror from way back in the day when they started making movies about it and everything. Of course, it's like the pagans versus the Christians, and the Christians are out to get the bad guys, right? Where our folk horror has always been the other way around, where it's just like we got judged very harsh for our beliefs. We were murdered for it. We were hunted for it. And it's just like, and we had to hide it behind the religions that were forced upon us. And so that in itself is a folk horror. So yeah, I am loving like all the modern folk horror that's coming up because of the fact that it's diverse and you're getting different aspects of it. So it's no longer like your typical like the Christians are ready to kill these witches because their witches are evil. And
Or
so
like just some small
yeah.
seaside British town with pagan. Like you think of it in the vein of maybe the Wicker Man, but what I love about the
Mhm.
documentary is it looked at different regions. Like it looked at Central and South America, it looked at East Asia, it looked at within Africa,
Mhm.
and like all the different types of folk traditions and how they were
Exactly.
communicated. And then, Olivia, is there anything else you'd like to try as a genre, or other parts within mystery or thriller? Or you're like, oh, I haven't tried this type of story yet that you're one day is on your bucket list to try?
You know, it's I don't know if I could say this for genre specifically. Um, my genre sometimes already kind of blends, because like I also do like dark fantasy and paranormal, and like but bigger more than any of that is like Afrofuturism. And so like it's hard to say if there's a genre that I would like to write because I often don't really sit down and go, I'm going to write this genre. I often will have like an idea for a story, and then the idea will come with things. Like a lot of times, I'm not putting things into my story. A lot of times, my characters are telling me who they are and what they are. Um, and so like it's difficult for me to say if there's a genre I want to try. Although that being said, now that Jessica has mentioned folk horror, I do love a good folk horror. So like I might actually actively try to give that a try. But I feel like I generally write a story, come up with a story idea, and then look at it afterwards, and I'm like, oh, this kind of fits this category,
Mhm.
as opposed to being like, I'm gonna write this genre. Um, because when you write a lot of times with all of these diasporic elements, a lot of times it becomes a mix of genres, whether you want it to or not.
It's probably the mix of diaspora because it is that meeting of cultures and that like movement of peoples. I also think obviously there's that limit of genre was invented to like sell and market, but things tend to cross over because you pull different elements, even as a writer, because you explore different things. Because you're writing about topics, you're writing about issues and thoughts and things that are what you're also thinking about deep down. Sometimes whatever the horror or the suspense is the metaphor for kind of can be across areas too. So, um, so I think this probably happens more when you're into like horror or dark elements. Sometimes you'll have people who are, either they'll come up to you at a convention and they're sort of walking the tables or friends in real life and they're just like, but why do you write that? Or also, I think because I also dabbled in horror, sometimes they're like, but you're not really a serial killer, right? Have you ever had odd questions or odd reactions to horror? People who make sort of interesting assumptions because you're into horror, or mystery, or darker themes.
I don't think I've had that experience yet. Yet, I say yet. Because I haven't been to many conferences and I've only come out with like one book, which is like my poetry collection. So I haven't had where I'm still working on the rewrites for my debut novel. So I'm wondering if I'll get questions about that. And it's interesting because like I don't think have or I don't know, maybe I will end up publishing some things that would just make people question my personality. I mean, if you look at my search history, that's a whole other story, right? Um, but yeah, I don't think I've had that experience. So I'm kind of looking forward to it because I don't know whether to, be serious about it and answer the question seriously or just like really freak them out and just, stare at them and be like,
Yeah. What about you, Olivia? Has there ever been like, why did you write that? Yeah.
Honestly, I think I've never really had this experience either, but I would argue that I haven't had this experience because if you get to know me, like I've said before, I collect skull and skull motifs. A lot of my day-to-day aesthetic is like a mix of like Afrofuturism, goth, excuse me, whimsy
okay,
goth, alternative things, and then just random spooky elements like woven in. So like I have like I'm wearing right now this glasses chain that has like bats on it.
I love that.
I might
Yeah,
on
I
a
do too.
random Wednesday be wearing some manner of skull. I've got like eyes on my shirt right now. So like for me, I think people would be more surprised if I wrote something just because I look like her. Right? I have a big purse that's a whole skull. His name is Bartholomew, not Bart. Don't nickname him. His name is Bartholomew. So like, I think people would be surprised if I was actually. People would be more surprised if I was like, oh yeah, like I write nothing but love stories and like fairy tales. Like I think people would be more surprised then.
Well, if you wrote
I
fairy
think
tales,
though.
they'd be like Grimm's originals.
Yeah,
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I
that's
think more
true.
than anything.
I had the pleasure of meeting Bartholomew.
Yes, you
Yeah, yeah,
did.
yeah.
I think, if anything, the question that I am somewhat anticipating, um, because in the same way that we were talking about, where we're flipping the script on not having like the Christians in the stories be like the heroes, I think, if anything, once like certain relatives and family members start to actually pay attention to my stories, there might be some questions from them. Um, because I often am looking at these people that have always been in movies and in TV shows and in everything, shown as like the good ones, and it's like, listen, no, the more power you have, the less good you can be. So, so I'm anticipating it. If anything, it's probably going to come from within my own background, as opposed to some stranger who's just at a book fair.
Yeah, that's true. Like
Mhm.
family is always the most honest of critics when they're around because they definitely feel the most able to like, I've known you your whole life. Let me give you some notes. Do
Yeah.
you think, have you noticed things? I don't know how long you've been in it or how long you've been just in the general horror mystery communities overall, but do you feel there's anything like particular about being a woman in that space or that frame of reference or things that you feel are a little bit different when you're a woman writing darker elements or writing horror mystery?
Oh,
And
that's
I feel like, oh, sorry, I'll let you go.
no, you go. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
We both were like ready to jump on that one. I feel like one of the things that horror can do, and there's why there's a lot of case studies, a lot of like thesis from people that are getting like doctorates, even as I get, and when I go to get my doctorate, because I am going to get my doctorate, we'll be even touching on this a little. There's a lot of like societal things that go into horror movies. I was watching something the other day, and they were talking about how Sinners is very timely because a lot of times when there's wrongs going on politically, there are like a vampire movie will spring up. And so I think that that is something that is very, that you can somewhat see the difference in men's horror movies and women's horror movies when you think about social and political things that are happening. Um, because sometimes the focus isn't on the whole spectrum of the story, I think. Um, because a lot of men's horror is very, maybe I don't know if general is the base is a good word, but it doesn't go as deep or as layered as it could. Is what I have found with male written horrors, especially like older ones. Some more modern ones are
Mhm.
getting better. Like with Sinners, um, I think he even said that he borrowed some things or studied some things or worked with his wife. So this is how Sinners also got to be as well written as it is. Um, and which is why I love that. Sinners is one of my favorites. It's such a good movie. Um, but I feel like other horror stories don't always do that. And like even though I do enjoy some of Stephen King's work, it's very there's definitely like a very Stephen King formula. You know what I mean?
Oh
Like
yeah.
it fits. And I think that's also what happens versus men writing horror versus women. Women go often will explore into things and be experimental, where men will stick to the horror script, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah. I'll let Jessica answer in a second, but I was thinking about one of the movies I liked that kind of started out as horror and almost comedy. And the last year was Your Monster, and I just call it as one of those good for her films where, not to go into spoilers, but
I love
eventually it's just kind of
those.
this woman who's had cancer and she's recovering and her life has fallen to crud and she thinks she's seeing like her closet monsters come to life. But like it's really just examining all that trauma and all that lack of support she's had in her life. So it has a monster in it, but it's internal. And I feel like I understand what you mean with that kind of internalized, like looking deeper part too, sometimes within feminine or women's
You know
horror.
what's like that? You know what's like that, but on a smaller level? I don't know if either of you have ever watched The Babadook.
I was just
Um,
gonna mention that.
I love
I'm
that
sorry, I didn't mean to
one.
steal your
No,
thunder.
no, no,
Oh
you're
no,
fine.
totally we love
But
it.
that's exactly what popped into my brain when Margaret was talking about sorry, Ivy was referencing the movie that she just watched because like right when in Babadook in particular, and sorry, spoilers, but it is an old movie, you should have watched it by now.
Yeah, it's
Um
like 10 minutes old.
Thanks.
yeah. Um the fact like it just it hit me in the way the yellow wallpaper hit me because if you watch little some like just reference about the let's just pretend that it came out way back when, right? So just like the yellow wallpaper, if you watch Babadook at a time when you're at a certain age as a female, in different aspects of your life, we have our different timelines because of just the way naturally how we are, right? And it's just it would hit very differently. I mean, at least for me, I would think it would do or like or would, right? Because in terms of the Babadook, and I'm gonna go right back into the yellow wallpaper specifically, reading it when I was in like sixth grade for the first time, right? You're talking about puberty, whatever, all that stuff going on. I was just sitting there thinking that she was just out of her freaking mind, right? And
Yeah.
then had to read it again in high school. Well, not as wiser, but just dealing with some certain things. And then I was just thinking that, oh wow, this is a ghost story. She's actually being haunted by something. So something's making her crazy, right? And for me in that environment as a high school teenager, you're always thinking that like in high school itself, you might have like something haunting you and going after you or whatever. And then as a woman, and then when I read it like much older, now as a perimenopausal fan club, woo woo, it brought different elements for me. And I think that's what women in horror does. It can kind of, and no disrespect to my men in horror, I love y'all, but I feel like it can be timeless, that it
Mm.
can uh address all the phases of a woman, right? Hearkening to our three phases, child, mother, or was it child, maiden, crone? I,
Yes,
it,
child
that
mother crone. Mhm.
specifically, like it really,
No, I'm
it's
sorry.
that timeless.
Maiden
And it's
mother
Mother
crone.
mother and
crone.
crone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, maiden mother
maiden. Yeah.
crone. Yes.
So, right. So that it can hit those phases of our lives. And I feel like some women in horror really touch on that. And then when you were saying Olivia, like, sorry, Olivia, yes,
You
when
got it.
they
Yes.
go deep into their emotions, deep into what their emotions were at one time, what it is presently, and what it can be later on in life. And it's just, again, you can watch it 10 years from now and it'll hit you differently and it'll still be a great movie, or you can read it 10 years from now and it'll still be very relevant to you as a woman. So for me, that's what I get from women in horror. And it's great to see a lot of women in horror because like we do deal with a lot of horrific stuff, mostly internally, aside from all the outside stuff.
Yeah, I was
Like
gonna say
we're
the
we're dealing with that
interiority of some of
too.
these films and like
Yeah.
stories is that level that Olivia's also talking about, where it's like you really get into the heads of the women protagonists because they're going through all these things that are so layered and not always the experience that is projected out there as often or gets as much of a platform in that way. There's a lot of
Yeah.
interiority, I think is a word for that for sure.
Yeah. And from the horror community that at least that I aligned myself with, I see a lot of the men in horror that are very, very supportive of women in horror. I mean, particularly, I actually am going to be at a conference in September, Creatures, Crimes, and Creativity. And it's just so many different people there from so many like different ages to different, professional levels to different, races and cultures and stuff and genders. And it's really great how like everybody's very supportive of each other, of like the type of horror that we're writing, we're learning from one another. And yeah, so from what I've seen, it's been supportive. And yeah, I agree. Like some modern men horror is actually starting to delve into their internal emotions, because they're starting to be a little bit more vulnerable than what they used to be.
And yeah, that's nice to see because we always talk about in general in women's circles, like how patriarchy hurts men. And I think there is that aspect of it hurts us, obviously, but it also hurts anybody because it limits like the roles you can be. And I think that sometimes has limited sometimes cishet men from like being able to dig deeper into or feeling free to even have more than one or two appropriate emotions. And so it's
Yeah.
nice to be able to see in the horror community people being able to explore all of those because where else are you going to get your trauma or your deeper seated thoughts out than like when you're processing horror through your characters and in yourself. Um,
Hmm.
so I don't have that many more questions left on the list, but as we've talked, I've had thoughts come up, and one of the things that came up with talking is we keep mentioning like movies and books that have hit us at different times, but overall, like what are a couple of your favorite horror books or authors that really were like the things that became you're like, I want to do this too. And also if there are other movies that were really big, like in your childhood or in your forming teenage years, you're like, no, this is what I love. I love a good mystery talk. I love a good gothic, out on the, height moors kind of feeling. Like, what were your big, like, oh gosh, that's my starstruck kind of author or movie moment?
There's so
Olivia,
many.
or just go
Uh,
whoever. Yeah.
there's so many, but
That's
I'm always so like enamored with gothic horror. There's a beauty to it, that monstrous aspect of that. There is a supernatural or a real monster in the story, but truthfully, it's what's happening around that or to the people in the story that are typically dealing with like some deep seated issues, and it could be like their own psychological or emotional trauma that's resurfacing. And so the supposed threat is not really the threat. It's the person that is like typically dealing with the threat, because I feel like a lot of gothic horror is that you can cross that line between, are you going to go into the dark side or you're being pulled in, especially when it's a trope that has like a woman that's the main character of this gothic horror. Is she going to get pulled into what would be considered as like the dark side? And, usually that's like a suppression of like some sexual feeling that she may have, and typically in gothic horror. But I just love the language, the prose, the nuances, the tropes behind it. I don't know if you can see my Edgar Allan Poe shrine behind me here. But
nice.
yes, I'm definitely a huge Edgar Allan Poe fan. I just kind of got started getting into like Hispanic Gothic. And so like Isabel Cañas or Sylvia Moreno Garcia, Sina Paleo, you also have Gabino Iglesias. These are well, Gabino doesn't necessarily write Gothic, but these are like modern Hispanic horror writers. And I think I'm I've been doing that in a way to like really connect with um more so of that part of the culture, especially if like I'm trying to lean my writing into that, because my culture is mostly what I've experienced here in the States versus like I wasn't born in Puerto Rico. I wasn't raised there. I've only visited once as a tourist. I don't have family there anymore. Like, so there's not like a real connection for me to be able to pull from that. I'm pulling from my ancestors and I'm pulling from our culture that's here, but I'm also like reading other writers who, are still immensely deep within the culture, and other modern horror writers. I mean, I don't think he's like typically a horror writer, S.A. Cosby, but he's more like mystery, suspense, thriller. Also, one of my friends who is also a horror writer, Vaughn A. Jackson, and he just came out with a vampire uh, novel, or I think it's supposed to be like a three-part series, and it's basically, if you like Sinners, you'll like it because it takes place like I want to say either during the Civil War or after the Civil War. So it's like Django Unchained meets Sinners type.
That would hook me right there. That has me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. That sounds awesome.
Can I find the book? Because for I'm having brain farts, perimenopause, yay! Um, it's been a time, but I haven't. Oh, it's right here. Yeah, it's called Southern Cross.
Oh, that was a really great cover too.
Yeah,
It just makes me
yeah,
think of
yeah.
like, and I've seen like YouTube video essays deconstruct it, but like that pervasive part in earlier media between like Twilight and the Vampire Diaries, the TV show, of like the good Confederate vampire. Now it's past that, but we don't question why he was a Confederate soldier, but we're still cool with him, even if it's been 100. Like, so I like to see this. No, it's Django Untamed and like Sinners, and this is gonna get what they're gonna get. Like, I'm like down with like all that other type of stuff. Like, explore it the way it should be. Yeah.
It's hilarious that you should say that. I'm gonna just say this one thing, and I'm gonna turn it over to you, Olivia. But because in his acknowledgement or dedication, it's like to my wife, who also wondered why the Confederate vampires were the good guys.
Yeah, I'm like, what? Okay.
It's just like, yeah, exactly.
So I think that I mean, horror, my love with horror has been long-standing. I think the biggest horror story that I fell in love with was Dracula. Um, I even recently, in one of my book design classes, redesigned a cover for it, which was really cool and fun. And On top of that, um, uh, my favorite parts of Dracula. This is where this is one of those parts where my dark mind came in. Because my favorite parts of Dracula are when Jonathan's getting tortured in the castle. Like that's the best part. It's always fun when it's like, "Hey, guy, don't do that thing. We're all warning you," and then stuff hits
You
the
do it
fan because you
anyway.
didn't listen. So it's like, well, here you go. Um, but I would say Dracula, but I also grew up like watching like Tales from the Crypt and Tales from the Hood um and Are You Afraid of the Dark, Goosebumps. So a lot of those influenced me growing up as far as like horror. There's so many things. I was a Nightmare Before Christmas kid, so like there's a lot of that. Um and growing up in Baltimore, you can't escape Edgar Allan Poe. So there's no getting around that. So there's also a love of that. Um, I think where the other sort of focuses of my genre might differ because those actually I could pinpoint specific things. Um, like with horror and Afrofuturism like sort of mix because one of the things about Afrofuturism, even though it is technically not horror, horrific things happen in within the walls of Afrofuturism because it's reflective of things that happen to Black people in real life. But like Tanana Reeve Dew, Nalo Hopkinson is one of my favorites, as well as Octavia Butler. And then as far as like
Mhm.
mystery, I actually was very inspired by Agatha Christie. You know, during the shutdown, my mom and I, it's hard sometimes to find things that we can both watch because I like horror, spooky things, anime. She does not. So it's often hard for us to find things that we can watch together. But we were able to watch like Perot and Miss Marple and binge watch those whole series during the shutdown during COVID. And Like during that time, I really fell in love with Perot and Agatha Christie's writing in that way. I also fell in love with, as far as mystery, like Carrie Greenwood, who writes the Miss Fisher series,
I was about to
and that
ask if you'd seen Miss
TV
Fisher
show.
because it sounded like it would be up your alley.
Yes, yes, I love that first TV show. Not too much a fan of the second show with the niece. It's okay, I guess, but I prefer the first one. But I'm also the type of person where I'm like, I like to compare the books to the movies, and there were no books on the second series. They just like did it, and I'm like, but I also like, as far as a modern writer, and this is more on the lighter side of mystery because this is a cozy mystery writer. And do forgive me if I mess up her name. Mia P. Manasala. I maybe have messed up that last name, but she writes Arsenic and Oboe. Um, and it is a really like because I really like Agatha Christie, and so and she's like, and Agatha Christie, like the mother of cozy mystery. Um,
Mhm.
and I've been working to And like my two main stories, like the one from grief and the one from anger, those are both mystery stories. And so I wanted to write a vein that was similar to the genre, but the modern cozy mysteries are a lot different than Agatha's cozy mysteries back when she was writing them in the 1930s. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that a lot of them have become more formulaic and I don't really like those structures and those constraints can sometimes be very difficult to write in. But I
Mhm.
really like what was done with arsenic and adobo. And I also like that she even said in the beginning of the book, like, yes, this is cozy mystery, but the police have had issues and attacked my community, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in the book. And a lot of cozy mystery shies away from that. And I think I like
Yeah.
that she doesn't. And that's something that I do want to try to emulate as best as possible within my mystery stories. And then really the last two things that kind of have just like sparked my interest in this genre just from like early on childhood, Scooby-Doo and Courage the Cowardly Dog. And like Courage the Cowardly Dog, taught me to fight your fears. Because Courage would be scared of whatever creature was coming, but he would go and get the blicky and come back.
Mhm.
And he would be on fight with whatever ghost he was fighting. Um, and Scooby-Doo, one of the great things about the original Scooby-Doo's, the original like 70s series and the What's New Scooby-Doo, and a lot of those is that those taught you that the real villains were your oppressors.
Mhm.
It's always Old Man
That's true.
Withers is just trying to bankrupt the amusement parks so you can buy it dirt
Exactly.
cheap. It was so many like I'm giving you a capitalistic scheme to exploit people, but I'll use a mask. And
Exactly.
Yeah,
it
yeah.
feels like that's now that I'm older and now that we're living through many things, including horrible economic times from oligarchs. You're like, yeah, the 70s, they had a lot of debt too. They get it. It's always some billionaire or some rich dude in town behind a mask. I'm like, good point. Good
Hmm.
point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like in the States in the 70s was like the height of peaceful protesting and definitely protesting against everything and loving one another and loving the environment and like it's just yeah, we're having a bit of a repeat of that. But yeah, so
Yeah. And then
uh
I think it's interesting, Olivia, when you mentioned really liking like Tales from the Crypt as a kid. Because I was thinking when you were talking about how you wanted to right wrongs and like in horror you can do that and you can kind of set up where like people who do bad things get punished, at least that have that actual like karma. That reminds me of like Tales from the Crypt and that very EC Comics kind of style, where there are very simple morality plays that people who are real jerks and con men and swindlers and murderers and gangsters in the end, in 30 minutes before you saw the Crypt Keeper again, whatever happened to them wasn't going to be good, but was going to be completely something they had earned on their own actions. And I always liked that kind
mhm.
of aspect to it.
And I love that. I don't know if you guys like so because like I also grew up on those shows and seen that where like a villain is just a villain. They just come on the screen and they're just like you already know that this guy, it's usually a guy, sorry. It's just like this person is just like horrific in general. And then when some people try to write villains in that way, right now, like, some writers will get a backlash about that, like, oh, there should be more to their story. Like there was like a trauma that turned them into this villain. It's just like, no, no, some people are just, I'm sorry to say it, some people are just kind of born this way or, raised in that aspect or like, just raised around villainous people. So that's just the way they are. Like it doesn't have to be something happened to them. Um, it makes for a great story. Yeah, it sure does. But then like now you're making a story about the villain. So I don't know.
I
I
can
think
even piggyback off of that. I think even, and because I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying there, Jessica, but I also think even if we piggyback off of that, like even if we write the tragic backstory for that villain, right? That still doesn't justify what they're doing. And so it's
Hmm.
like, yeah, sure, maybe this really terrible person had a that doesn't take away from the story. And my thing is, the villain, if we have a villain in a story, he's not he. I'm saying he because it's usually he,
That's what
but
we're used to.
they're, they're not. That's not the person. Your focus is in the wrong area. Like that's not the main character. One of my favorites, and I think you mentioned this author, Jessica. One of my favorite books is Gods of Jade and Shadow. I think that's the same
Mhm.
person that has written Hispanic Gothic,
Yeah,
which I do need to read
Sylvia.
Hispanic Gothic because I love Gods of Jade and Shadow. It's one of my favorites. And I remember looking at Goodreads and somebody made a comment about how they felt like the granddad character was too cartoonishly villainous, or however they said it. And I'm like, girl, this is in the 1930s, 1920s, and this was a man. That's how they were.
Mhm.
because nobody was checking them or had the time
Yeah.
or was stopping them. He was the head of a family. That's how they were. Like sometimes in this quest to like be like, well, what if something happened to them? Or let's try to flesh out that character. We're also forgetting the fact that like people like this really did exist. People like this really do exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And
there's
they
that
never really, yeah, really like came out with about their feelings and like, back to that character and specifically, it's just not only it was a man in the 1930s, but also like he was part of a culture that is very steeped into patriarchy. And that
Exactly.
even the women who supported that same rules and just in culture. So it was just it's kind of it's kind of strange to see that or whatever, especially when you're talking about a culture that still is very rooted into that aspect. So
Right.
much so that like it raised their women to be a certain way. And I say that all respectfully because I come from a Hispanic culture and personally we had to deal with that. And it wasn't so much like we were fighting against the men about it. We're actually fighting against some of the women in the family about it. So it's kind
well,
of
there's that
anyways, but
handmaiden
like going
aspect
back.
of things, the internalized misogyny that sometimes,
Mhm.
you can be like,
Yeah.
I could fight this system, but it benefits me. So I kind of become inculcated to it, and then at least I'll get my slice, a smaller slice, but I
Yeah.
can, reassure the patriarch. Same thing with like, we always, I mean, there becomes often in like white liberal women's spaces that like, oh, like not us or like whatever, but also the idea that like it's usually just bad white guys, bad white men. And it's like, but yeah, but there's so much of like what white women have done throughout the years and daughters of Confederacy and making monuments to things that are would be like putting up monuments to Auschwitz and et cetera, and all that hand washing and hand and like whitewashing of things that they were completely complicit in because it was like better to be like getting scrapped as kind of like the preferred house pet than being out there and like thrown into like the wilderness. And like there's always that like decisions where people are making choices to be the villains as well and to assist things or
Hmm.
get their side piece or their like angle or their percentage of it because it still ends up benefiting them more than someone else. At least that I'll be better off than
Yeah.
that one person, or I'll be the woman who goes along with the guy who's awful, but at least I'll be slightly better off. And it's hard. Like to see it's
Yeah.
frustrating, but there is that problem where sometimes there just isn't that solidarity that you assume would be in a group of women or in other places.
Yeah, yeah. And then I mean, like we kind of I kind of drove us into another topic, but I mean, just harkening back again to just like I get that a lot of the characters in a story should be fleshed out in a way where they can be real or relatable. But I think a lot of people are forgetting when you're reading a story from a particular time, it's not going to be relatable to what you're dealing with right now. And there might be some similar aspects, but there are going to be things that are going to be to the extreme because of the fact that not many people fought it, not many people could fight it. And so they were just very rooted in that. And unfortunately, in speaking with like gothic horror, there are some cartoon villains twisting their mustaches and everything, tying you up to train tracks. It
Yeah,
exists for a
Mhm.
reason.
it's Snidely Whiplash. And I think that one other thing is, and one of my backgrounds is in psychology, one of my degrees is, but like you say, like I feel like you see that trend sometimes, especially in certain spheres of like niches of subliterature. Sometimes I see it not in the general community always, but like in certain people within dark romance will take it too far or be like, I have to excuse the villain and like he is the star because it's kind of how dark romance rolls, and some who just don't get their lines or boundaries. That's my way of saying is like that people go through a lot of trauma and abuse, and a lot of people do, but not everybody who endures that becomes a villain in real life or in fictional life and uses it as an excuse to propagate the cycle. Some people are like, this happened to me,
Mhm.
so I want to spend my life trying to be better, trying to protect others. So people who still use that as their like shorthanding it, man pain excuse to like inflict that down the line, I'm not necessarily impressed with them or their like whoopee backstory or whatever, to use a fan fiction kind of term, a whoopee backstory on that, because you could still make the choice every day to try and be better and not hurt people or not use it as your reason to hurt people. Um, Also, long story short, but there's an episode of the spinoff of Buffy called Angel. In the final season, Spike's living with Angel, doing stuff with his team in LA, yada, yada, yada. And they have to go and collect a Slayer who got called, who went nuts, and she wasn't properly found in time, and she's violent, and she ends up mutilating Spike, and it all gets kind of resolved. But at the end, Spike and Angel are sitting in the hospital room because like Spike's recovering, has a lot of injuries. And Angel says, I feel bad for her because before she was called, before she went insane, she was just an innocent person. And Spike looks at him and says, "So were we once upon a time." And they're between the two of them know they've been the scourge of Europe and have, as like unsold vampires, etc., killed thousands of people. And I think that's the point. Like at some point, someone might have been the victim, but then they eventually make that active choice to inflict pain on others. And sometimes it's okay to just have a villain, and you're like, yeah, they made that choice. They're the bad guy. And also, as a third point to that, I'd add that I used to think you had to work on more nuanced villains because of what I had read because of media I'd seen in the 90s and 2000s. And sometimes I feel like from real life and just looking at the villains we're dealing with now, sometimes people really are just cartoon characters. Sometimes people in real
Mhm.
life are more cartoonishly evil and greedy, and that's their one thing than you ever thought they'd be in a book. And I'm like, why did I spend so much time trying to layer a villain when some of them are just here because they want the Benjamins and that's all they're here for? So,
Like right now, like right now, right now,
oh
Yeah.
yeah, no, like
like right now, like right
well,
now.
I'm gonna
Facts.
go there, but like you've got the South Park episode, and it makes me think of back when I first saw their South Park Scientology episode, and they had the disclaimer of, no, this is what Scientologists really believe about thetans and aliens. I'm like, they made this up. They're South Park. Of course they did. I Googled it. I was like, what? But the same thing, I feel like, because, name and shame. Christy Nome, our like fascist jerk in chief with her Gestapo, with all the ice crap. And you're watching the South Park episode going like, she's shooting a lot of puppies in the face. And you Google it and you go, oh, she actually did that, was proud of it, and put it in her autobiography. And you're like, you could never sit down and write a villain in any just regular horror or gothic book or whatever and be like, yeah, they kill puppies all the time. You'd be like, that's a little much. But no, that's what we live in. So, like, also the
Mhm.
villains that we write sometimes reflect the villains of our times. The villains of our times are Vanta blacks, evil people who are venial, greedy creatures who want the least of us to suffer and call it out. Like sometimes villains are just villains, and sometimes that is in our fiction too.
Yeah, yeah. So when it comes to horror, I mean, I feel like it's more acceptable for a supernatural
Yeah.
villain to be so villainous and evil than it is for like a human being. Like, I mean, you see the atrocities that we
Yeah.
do to each other, and sometimes there isn't a reason. It's usually because they can do it. Um, so yeah, I honestly don't even know how I brought you all along into my rant about this.
No, I
It's a
appreciate
shared
it.
rant.
I mean,
It's
it's
a
not where I
shared
thought it
rant.
would go, but yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. I think we'll have that same sentiment. Yeah. And I
And I
think,
think it's also relevant for what we're talking about because one of the great things about writing in horror and mystery is it is one of those genres that does still allow for villains to be villains. Like we were just talking about Tales from the Crypt. In the same vein of how Tales from the Crypt, you know who's gonna get it because they show you who the obvious bad guy is. A lot of cozy mysteries, one of the definitions of the genre, it doesn't always happen, but one of the definitions of the genre is that the person that's going to die is usually like a rich, rude, mean, evil, like terrible person that's like in control of people, or that's like being very bossy and mean to everyone around them, like puppeteering their family members. That's usually who dies in the cozy mystery, and who we just have to find out who killed them. So, like, these genres are one of the I feel like last surviving genres that allow for villains to be villains without us having to like, what happened in their backstory? A lot of cozy mystery is like the guy's rich. He's a rich asshole. We don't care what happened. We know what happened. He has too much money and power. And that's a lot of, interestingly, that's a lot of how Agatha Christie wrote these characters. And so that's why it's one of the tiers of cozy mysteries.
Mhm.
also, I think you have to
Yeah.
have done enough awful things to get people mad enough to want to kill you And if you're like a landlord or you're someone who's shutting down someone's
Exactly.
housing
Hmm.
or
Exactly.
you're whatever, then you have that leverage to make people that desperate and angry. So it is a lot of karma reinforced. So,
Yeah, and
uh,
sorry, and that typically is the background that we get of that particular villain, right? Because they're asking questions during, doing the investigation, and so when they're talking to, the usual suspects or what have you, they get into what experience they had with that person. And it's always a bad experience. It's never like, oh, this person was great. They were so charitable, blah, 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 blah. It's always like something really terrible about this person. You're sitting there like, well, damn, I probably would have killed their ass.
yeah, I was watching the Netflix version of the first book in the Thursday Murder Club was made into a movie. And basically the guy who gets killed in the first 20 minutes, who's the victim, is a landlord. And so it's sort of digging into what he's been doing. And he's supposed to be the nice one because he's the one part of this property ownership and among three dudes who was nice to the residents. But like you say, within Cozy Mysteries, as you dig, you find out, oh, he's done some major, major crimes. Of course, people are going to be mad and they're going to want to be like having a list of suspects 8 people deep. And yeah, that definitely comes up in those kind of books. So y'all, the last sort of main question I had was talking about your perspective or like your projects you're working on now or about to be drafting. I know that Jessica, you said you're in the middle of revising your debut novel. And then Olivia, you have things that are you're working between your two big projects. So do you want to talk about those? Whatever tidbits you can reveal at this time.
You want to go first, Jessica?
Sure, I'll go first. I've been doing rewrites for a very long time, so please send help and coffee. Uh, so no, seriousness. I'm working on a Puerto Rican Gothic novel that has to do with, just touching within like the diaspora that happened like within the 1800s, going from this one Puerto Rican woman's experience being raised by her English father in the UK, and then just almost immediately had to escape over to Puerto Rico and basically seeing like the injustices that are occurring there while simultaneously being haunted by a spirit of some sort that basically followed her over to there, along with, certain family members that you're not so sure of whether they're like there to help her or not. There's that. It's supposed to be part of a series. So I have like other two stories that are waiting in the wings for that, but I'm not really going to go into it. I'm thinking of, I've been dealing with so much anxiety with that book, with the rewrites, that I think I'm going to put it to the side again. And maybe at this point, probably hire an editor or somebody that can like work with me in a time phase with that because it's just been so much. So while that's just simmering, I'm gonna be working on a collection of short stories. Uh, so this is where really like my love for folk is coming in. Um, and yeah, so they're gonna be dealing with is essentially a theologist woman. Again, it's like seven then in the 1800s who was going around in the world, who's being invited to different parts of the world to have to deal with some sort of supernatural elements, and she has to report it back over to the church specifically. And so she's going to not only witness, but eventually, I think what's going to be the last story in the book, where she's going to have to perform her own exorcism.
Very cool.
And yeah, so it's been simmering in my head for like since last year to do that, especially when we went to Iceland. And I was like, "Ooh, I would really love for this like last story to take place in Iceland." So I did pick up like two Icelandic books. By the way, I don't know if anybody knows this, but they're very big on literature. Um, just look into like Iceland and literature. I believe they got like some sort of recognition by UNESCO as being like I don't remember specifically what it is, but I know it's like very stemmed into literary arts.
That's really cool.
They're they yeah, they're constantly publishing books, and I read one book that was like amazing, and I'm like in another one. And yes, it's in English because I don't read Nordic. But yeah, I'm working on those things, and I may work on a Poe project. I'm still kind of like on the I might just like leave that on the side until like I actually finish something. I need to accomplish something right now because I just like I said just last year I did the poetry collection book, and now I feel like I really want to put something else out there.
And you, Olivia?
So don't hold me to this because I am constantly working on like 12 projects at once, like 12 plus, because I have ideals and titles, and then it's just like, girl, sit down and get them out. Um, So the most recent thing that I have published is called Chasing Butterflies and Other Dubious Choices. It's a very experimental book, like it's also a little unedited. It's kind of that experimental, so go in there with that. But it's also a collection of short stories. Like some of them are poems, some of them are just like fragmented writing. Um, one of them, which is one of my favorites, like when I talk about like writing about dreams that I had, one of them is this dream that I had where I was cleaning my grandmother's house with my father, and my mom came in, and my dad ended up getting eaten by like a skinwalker sort of shapeshifter creature, and and what ends up happening, like, and this is right at the beginning, so I'm not giving you any spoilers, is that I kind of make the decision to stay in the house because now I own this house, even though the skinwalker is in the house and I know it is. And so dealing with that, because that really kind of addresses one, like the loss of my grandmother and losing some of the things that she had, but also when you go from never having owned a house to a situation where you can own a house, what are you willing to put up with to maintain that? Um, and so a lot of the choices in the book are like there's horror, there's some speculative. I mean, it's all pretty speculative, but that's out. That was an exclusive that I did have for the Woman Right Festival. But now I will be selling copies also at the Crimes, Creatures, and Creators Convention. I will also be at that. Thank you, Jessica, who was the one who told me about that at the Woman Right
Well,
Festival.
we gotta
So
connect.
yes, absolutely. Um, and the other thing that I'm working on is a tarot card mystery series. So, like, I have these two
Ooh.
main series that I've talked about, one that came from grief and one that came from spite and anger. And my tarot card mystery series actually is the one that came from spite and anger. One of the things that happened was my aunt saw me reading tarot cards and was like, well, I spoke to God, and God told me you got to get rid of the tarot cards. And I was like, oh, bet. She must not realize you don't really tell me what to do at this point. I'm gonna do what I want. So that series was born from me being like, yeah, no. When I write the series, this is another piece of mine that's very experimental because I go into the stories not knowing who the murderer is until all the way up until the end, and I let the tarot cards tell me who's going to be the murderer. So I actively can't write the book without tarot cards. And as such, my character also solves murders with tarot cards and using tarot cards. She happens to be a hoodoo practitioner. Her parents were the parents in the 70s who were not fully members of the Black Panther Party, but were definitely along the lines of those beliefs. And so they named all of their children after Orisha. The main character's name is Oya. And so it's very The story takes place in like 2004, but it also is a story that takes place in Baltimore, which, as someone who has grown up in Baltimore, even though I've gone away to school and things, I still have come back and like another part of another piece of me reclaiming and doing a lot of reclaiming is loving the home that I grew up in because Baltimore is like people what people don't realize unless they really come and spend time here is it's kind of like New York light. Like it's a nice city that feels like a major city, but it's close enough to the county where you can still get rest and get peace. So there's a wonderful like balance here. We have a
Yeah, that's the
wonderful art
crazy
community and
thing
a
is you go
wonderful
far enough north, you hit like Hartford or you hit places like the next county over,
Mhm.
or like you go to
Yeah,
Patapsco, like part you're like, there's greenery. It's a mix of so many things and like
exactly.
so many different
Exactly.
neighborhoods too. I love Baltimore, but
Exactly.
it's been
And
college here so
so
long.
I'm writing, and so I'm with that story, I'm writing that in Baltimore and particularly in Baltimore County, because a lot of spaces in Baltimore County, Woodlawn, Pikesville, Owings Mills, a lot of these places have towns within themselves that are very similar to like the sort of like towns that you would see in like British cozy mysteries
Mhm.
of in themselves. They've got their own festivals, they've got their own stores, they've got their own neighborhood vibes. And so this is what I'm experimenting with that book. And then I also have my other murder mystery series, which was actually born from grief. And probably the first series that I started looking at writing murder mysteries is a cozy mystery story that takes place in Trinidad, and came from the death of my grandmother. It's one of those really bittersweet things where I wish she would be here to see the series once it's published, but I would not have had the story idea without her passing, because in the same way I was dealing with her grief when she died, my main character, Ginger, is also dealing with the grief of her grandmother. And the difference is she's dealing with the grief of her grandmother, being an American born and raised person now living in Trinidad, where her Trini grandmother has passed away. And this is also not this is also not another spoiler. One of the things about cozy mysteries is the first death you know about right away. Literally, you pick up the bag and it's like, this person is gonna die. Who killed him? And then so this is not a spoiler, just letting y'all know because it's in the description.
Yeah.
But the first like her one support system left after her grandmother dies, which was her cousin. Um, he's murdered in a party with all of his closest friends. So now
Mhm.
she has to go through these friends and figure out like who killed my cousin. Um, also while dealing with the grief of her grandmother, also while dealing with being a fish out of water in a whole other country. Uh,
Yeah.
and and then on top of that, her grandmother's ghost is like hunting her dreams. Um, and so like that one's very layered. That's one that I also had to like in the same way Jessica was talking about like she had to pull back from one of her stories. That's one where I have to like pull back from, jump back in, pull back from, back in, because I directly have to deal with um with that sadness and that loss still. So those are the major things that I'm working on. So don't listen, don't quote this if something else gets published before then, because again, I told y'all I got 12 plus titles.
No, it's fun to give the hints. And I know, like, again, I feel like it's when teachers put out syllabi, like the schedule's not finalized. Sometimes when authors have something that strikes them as inspiration, like this order is not necessarily guaranteed. We're working through both the muse and what, like, I can finish.
Mhm.
So my last question is more sort of the short one. Where can people find you? What social media platforms are you on? Do you have websites? Give us your how to find you and support you spiel.
So for me, I'm in the process of redoing and recreating my website, and there are some things going on in the background of that. So right now, I'm on Instagram, and Facebook, but you can also literally follow me. The best place to follow me is my link tree. It's literally just like the slash and then Olivia Springer, and that's where you'll find me.
And Jessica, where can we find you?
I'm on TikTok. I'm also on Facebook, sparingly, and Instagram. And I also have a website, which I don't necessarily like update too much. So if you want to like find current information, essentially it's mostly Instagram or on TikTok. Usually my handle is under like Sparrow's Inkwell. That's my website too, www.sparrowsinkwell.com. But yeah, you can find me on TikTok under as Jessica L. Sparrow, the same way on Facebook. Actually, I may drop my author Facebook to redo that one. I'm more active on my personal Facebook, so I gotta like split the two. So just follow me on Instagram and TikTok. That's better. That's you get the most current.
All right. Thank you guys so much. And thank you for being on the Horror Mystery and Suspense Writers panel for the whole Right Women Book Festival, Right Women organization. And it was lovely talking
Cool.
with you.